the time where the KGB tried to steal a French-made Mirage from the Lebanese Air Force. The Dassault Mirage 111 is a single-seat, single-engine fighter plane that was developed by the French aircraft company Dassault Aviation in 1961. This was the third iteration of the original Mirage, manufactured after the French government requested a lightweight, all-weather interceptor 9 years earlier, 1952. The original plan was to export a number of these aircrafts to select countries including Argentina, Brazil, and Lebanon. When the Mirage first touched down in Lebanon, it was the first aircraft of its kind in the Middle East, and therefore became valuable in the eyes of the Soviets, meaning that in true Cold War fashion, the Russian government saw something that they didn't have and didn't know how to manufacture in its entirety, and thus set the KGB to work in acquiring said technology. The Russians particularly wanted the Mirage because they recognized it as a development in aviation that, due to its French manufacturer and the relations between said countries, they were not likely to get their hands on it legally. Thus, thievery was their second port of call. The Russians saw the plane's delivery to the Middle East, in this instance Lebanon, as their best chance to acquire said aircraft. In Russian eyes, it wouldn't be that hard. They already had agents in country and operational contacts throughout the country. What could go wrong? The KGB, only a couple of months after the plane had entered Lebanon airspace, had a plan and actors in place to bring the aircraft back to the motherland. The plan was thus: representatives or KGB agents pretending to be representatives from the Soviet embassy in the nation's capital of Beirut would approach anyone who had contacts within the Lebanese Air Force who might be willing to operate against his nation's interests. With these conditions, they found ex-Lebanese Air Force officer Hassan Badawi. Hassan fit all requirements, having served in the Air Force, but also the fact that he had been dishonorably discharged on grounds of misconduct, having been caught both smuggling and selling drugs. The Russians identified him as a person who not only held a grudge against the Lebanese Air Force, but also as an individual who enjoyed living the high life, who happily lived beyond his means to the point that he had to operate illegally to fund said lifestyle. They found that the former Air Force pilot was currently working as a commercial pilot for Middle East Airlines, and his pay wasn't substantial enough to allow the poor soul to walk around the streets of Beirut with large mounds of cash as he was accustomed to. The KGB agents had found the perfect middleman. This wasn't the KGB's first time at flipping a man against his country for their own purposes. Hassan, of course, agreed to go along with the plot, for the promise of personal gain and possibly to kick back against the country he thought betrayed him. Hassan Badawi immediately got to work, trying to get in contact with the pilots of the ever so sought-after Mirages. Eventually he found Lieutenant Mahmoud Matar, and with the promise of lots of money, offered him an opportunity to become a traitor to his country and help a regime responsible for millions upon millions of deaths get even more powerful. Matar agreed. Soon after, he was brought to meet with the KGB agents in charge of the plot. They informed him of their plan. On his next long-range training operation, he was to rise to 3,000 feet and feign technical difficulties, cut radio transmissions, and cross into Turkey, where shortly after, 3 interceptors would chaperone him to Baku in the then Soviet-controlled nation of Azerbaijan. During this meeting, the Soviets unveiled his prize for such betrayal: $3 million to be paid on completion of the mission. This amount was later to be found out to be a fabrication by Hassan, who had gotten carried away, offering $2 million more than he had been told to. After negotiations, this price was lowered to $2 million. Then he would rendezvous with his family in Switzerland, which the KGB promised to keep safe in the meantime. They also gave Matar $200,000 up front at his request. Matar also requested this money to be given to him in the form of a cashier's check, not trusting in his abilities to detect forged banknotes. The Lebanese pilot played his role so well, the KGB agents didn't even bother to acquire the check from a non-Russian bank, obviously inculcating the Kremlin in such activities. After this meeting, the plan was set to occur on October 3, 1969. However, the KGB, the then greatest spying operation in the world, had been double-bluffed. Mahmoud Matar had actually been working as a double agent from the point of his so-called agreement with Hassan. Immediately after Hassan had approached him, Matar went straight to his superiors and informed them of the plot and the conspirators at play. Although there isn't any record of Matar's thoughts on the matter, it is probably safe to assume that after this confession, he would have thought his part in the matter was over, that he'd receive a well-earned pat on the back, a possible promotion, and that would be the end of it. However, before leaving his superiors, he was given a new assignment: to go along with the Soviets' plan with the end goal of obtaining enough evidence to ensure that Hassan and the KGB members involved would be charged with espionage. Therefore, during the final meeting between the Soviets and Matar, with everything set to go, in the Soviets' eyes anyway, Lebanese officers burst into the room and a shootout commenced. Within this, both KGB members and several of the Lebanese police's number were injured. Thankfully, none were killed. Eventually, the police overpowered the two agents, Vladimir Vasiliev, who had, officially speaking, been working as an engineer with the Soviet embassy, and Alexander Komiakov, a colonel in the Soviet Committee for State Security, as well as Hassan Badawi. It is probably correct to assume that due to the vast amount of information collected, the obvious plot of theft, and the activity of the KGB within the country of Lebanon, that these two KGB agents would therefore face the penalties of said country, possibly resulting in life imprisonment or death. However, due to almost immediate protests from the Kremlin inundating the offices of high-ranking officials within Beirut to release the Russian agents immediately, this did not occur. In the eyes of the Lebanese government, Russia was too powerful to have as a declared enemy, too powerful for the Lebanese government to make a stand against, considering that due to the underhanded nature of global politics during the Cold War, the Russians went to their more powerful Middle Eastern allies such as Egypt and Syria and pressured them to, in turn, put pressure on the Lebanese government to make this story of Russian incompetence simply go away. Therefore, whilst the two agents were still in the hospital care, the order came down from on high that the KGB operators were to be shipped to Beirut International Airport, where a plane was waiting to transport them back home to Moscow. The government also issued a media blackout, stopping this story of espionage, making it to the tongues of civilians on the ground. The media blackout was justified, with that context, as being in the country's higher interest. Hassan, however, remained a patsy thrown to the wayside by the Russian government once their plan had failed, and Matar did receive that promotion after all, only quietly rising to captain. In the wake of this incident, the US stepped up their operations within the Middle East in an effort to either thwart or beat Russians to many a punch. Their foreign policy and operation within less economically developed countries, LEDCs, became more intense, beginning a campaign which educated their overseas representatives and their families of the dangers and likelihood of being approached by an agent affiliated with the Soviets or their allies. This dovetailed with the Russians cutting funds to the same areas, possibly out of embarrassment from this incident. However, it wasn't only the US who thought it prudent to step up their games in terms of counterintelligence in response to Soviet spies. Nearly all of the US's allies at the time, including such as Morocco and France, became much tighter in control of their embassies, ensuring almost nothing unauthorized got in or out. The relationships between the countries said before have never truly recovered since the Cold War. Basically, since Hitler was defeated, the Russians and the Americans have been in silent battle for dominance over one another. This, of course, culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it would be silly to assume such espionage and underhanded tactics were not still in play today, decades after the supposed end of the Cold War. In fact, as recently as 2016, it was proven that Russia, in one way or another, did in fact meddle in the democratic operations of the US. They in some way hacked or messed with the election, which ultimately ended with the election of Donald Trump. This, combined with the conflict the two nations had over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the US actively funded resistance groups, paints a picture of two nations quietly posed and ready for war, waiting for a provocation that would, in the eyes of the world media, allow all-out war, as neither will allow themselves to be perceived as the weaker counterpart. It is also generally accepted that Russia plays from a quite different hymn sheet in terms of international relations and conduct between sovereign nations, playing fast and loose with agreed-upon boundaries, and that Russia is not to be trusted in terms of espionage. The trust that some other countries have today in the Russian government and political system is strikingly low, with numerous reports of anti-Putin journalists and captains of Russian industry, oligarchs, dying in mysterious ways throughout Vladimir's reign as president. These countries have all had very complicated paths and presents, with the future shaping up to be no easier. The US and Russia, however, are still the pillars, the world's superpowers in terms of political and military dominance on the world stage. Therefore, their relations with the countries previously mentioned are incredibly important for all of us. France, for example, has had a rather steady relationship with the US for the past couple of decades, having no major spats or international incidents during this time. France and Russia, however, is a different matter. The relationship has been rocky to say the least. The French signed an agreement with Russia in February 1992, thereby recognizing Russia as the successor of the USSR, thus becoming allies. However, since then, the relationship has been rather turbulent. Putin has now been in office to see 3 French presidents come and go, now working with the 4th in Macron. Due to these changing figureheads, France's policy towards Russia has changed also. The relationship was indeed strong during the administration of Jacques Chirac from 1995 to 2007, within which time the French stood with countries such as Germany to oppose the US intervention in Iraq. The Russians, therefore, seeing any stance against America as in favor of them, love this, resulting in Putin even attending the funeral of Chirac in September 2019. This bond, however, hit an all-time low in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, sanctions, and the cancellation of contract for the sale of 2 Mistral helicopter carriers. Now, under the rule of Emmanuel Macron, France has adopted a strategy of dialogue and firmness when dealing with Russia. The story is similar with Russia and Lebanon. To this day, neither country, particularly Lebanon, trust each other fully. Lebanon will probably always hold Russia in quite suspicion due to their past actions, and Russia, being a country still laden with old Soviet influences, may have to wait some time before a truly trustworthy and trusting nation emerges completely. Their relationship, however, does differ in one way. Russia is not afraid to directly give orders to the Lebanese government. In an article written by Tony Staff of the Times of Israel back in 2018, we are told that Russia regularly tells Lebanon how they should operate in terms of national defense, in particular, their border with Israel, especially with regard to the action of Hezbollah in the region. This would suggest that Russia sees Lebanon as under their power, as a state still afraid of their power, and sadly, they're probably right.